Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on Feebleminded by Ariana Harwicz. I was entranced by this book. It was one of the most raw, unflinching novels I've ever experienced. There was something terrifying on many of these pages. I would be peering over my shoulder to see, is there anybody else back there who's peeking at the same pages I'm reading, who's seeing these words in this sequence, these thoughts laid bare, these fears, desires, spelled out for the reader. And it is a book that some might regard as transgressive or disturbing. And perhaps it is, but it's also a book that feels true, that feels authentic and genuine. There are some writers who want to take a scalpel to a character's consciousness and just cut as deep as they can and lay that out there for everybody to see. The surgery here is not a scalpel, it's something else, and it's just the guts ripped out. Everything is laid out for a reader to experience and to really reflect on and examine. The words rush at us, the images rush, the fears and emotions rush at the reader. And so it's a masterpiece in my reading. I could not put it down. I was rereading pages. I was drifting back and forth. It was one of the most compulsive reading experiences I've had this year or ever. I absolutely loved it. Absolutely recommend it. I want to give you just a sense of what this book sounds like. This is how it opens. I come from nowhere. The world is a cave, a stone heart crushing you, a horizontal vertigo. The world is a moon slashed by black whips, by arrows and gunfire. How far must I dig before striking disdain, before my days burn? I could have been born with white eyes like this forest of stark pines, and yet I'm awoken by volcanic ash on the garden clover. And yet my mother's pulling out clumps of hair and throwing them on the fire. The day begins. I'm a baby, and my mother's in her armchair with her back to me, crying. I wake up as a girl, outside the lavender, inside mother, her black hair in the embers. Cuttings of cloud everywhere, low and pasty, high and fleeting, dark and nondescript. And that's how this book reads. We again have a mother and daughter. It's not too far from what Ariana Harwicz was working with in Die My Love, an earlier book that sort of forms an informal trilogy, and another stone cold modern classic. But Feebleminded goes elsewhere. The mother and daughter now are a little bit older. We have a daughter who's a young woman, or certainly a late adolescent, and with that now there's this sense of kinship that they share. That they're not just beings now, but they're not just members of a family together, but that the daughter is a sexual being now. And so what transpires across this book are these different memories, these different experiences that flood as sensations across the daughter's mind. It's primarily from her perspective, even as she's considering how things could look from her mother's perspective or even her grandmother's perspective. At one point, she thinks about not just her birth or her childhood, but rather how was she conceived? And the detail is there. She thinks of it in specific language, specific words. And so, as I said, this is a book that some think is transgressive, but rather what it is Harwicz giving a different view to topics and books that men have been writing about for decades and being celebrated for decades. I was certainly reminded of something like Philip Roth's various works, or even Nabokov. Writers who seem to be transgressive, Henry Miller, writers who seem to be laying bare what their experiences are like as sexual beings, as men. And here we have a perspective from a young woman. And what is it that feels so troubling about that? It's her point of view. She remembers, afterwards, if I'm not delirious, he said he had to stop coming so often. He wanted to say something, but he couldn't. Though he said it clearly enough when we went under the bridge and the echo sent it back. Something about his situation, the context, being responsible, that we'll still see each other, that it would be crazy not to, that I'm not in his brain so I can't understand, that I should try being in his brain just for a second, that he won't be able to drive all the way here so often, that he's risking everything, that he'll text me about it when we can next meet. I listened with the reverential astonishment of a feeble-minded woman, getting things muddled, lost in the countless details that engulf her, a plague of microbes on the esplanade. I mistake the swishing of the animals for the plants, sunburnt lizards scuttling into the drain pipes. By the end, everything was vague, inexact, blurred. What had he just told me? We were still yoked together, my mouth an elongated snout. Where were those words coming from? Why had he chosen them and not others? What language should we use when we name things? How does anyone manage to speak at all? What had he said? I'd forgotten it already. It was the thick liquid of his saliva collecting and separating in his mouth. That transition of a mouth into divinity, like an incurable genetic condition. He finished his speech and we kissed. And kissing was a steady advance, knife raised high. And there's foreshadowing there. That final sentence, kissing was a steady advance, knife raised high, is terrifying. There's a dread that exists across these pages. That as we see someone's life and heart laid bare and just stripped out for us as readers, we see what these experiences lead this person to. Earlier, where we're being told that, where this narrator is being told that she needs to get in his mind, that's what we so often have done as readers when we dip into the mind of a writer like Roth or Nabokov, Updike, so many others who write from their point of view about how they view and desire and objectify others. And here we have this unnamed narrator turning the tables on them. Later on, she'll say, I checked the phone and nothing, not a single message all weekend after the Red Room, not a single missed call after the standing penetration, after the levitation, after the hand gripping my neck, the succulent mound, after the explosion of the impossible itself. Nothing, I repeat, nothing, I repeat. And the phone, I stare at it, put it down, pick it up again, start the sequence afresh, check, rage, worry, leave it on the ground, then check again. Leave the phone face down on the table, on the grass, pick it up and it's covered in ants, blow so they don't get inside, and still nothing. The world abruptly colored like a murky sky. It's that crucial moment when anyone with any sense decides to leave. And so there's a passion that underlies these pages. But we see that, as with the knife raised high, there's a violence that starts to push forward. And not just a physical violence, but this emotional and verbal violence. A consideration of things from this character's point of view, but also she tries to think of, as I said, her mother, her grandmother. How is she viewed by them? What are the conversations they have? How is she viewed at work? And as this book continues, we start to see that all is not well within her relationship, that the mistrust we could expect, the lack of transparency that has been just obvious from the very beginning, is leading us towards a very dangerous path, that there's almost this competition that exists between mother and daughter. And I won't spoil the ending, but there's a passage towards the end that is just absolutely fascinating. If an aviator saw us from above, he'd fall out of the sky, letting his plane plunge headlong into the green chaos below, heart hammering, lunging forward with flailing arms. I am broken apart, and it's like driving through a field of hawks, accelerating until everything's a whirlwind of flame, wandering through space but holding fiercely to the ground. I feel her vibrations and impurities. I fall at her feet, the claws of the beast. Mother, forgive me for betraying you. Yes, that's exactly what it was, she says, a betrayal and a brazen one. I know. Forgive me, Mummy. Staring into each other's eyes, we're two bees suspended like objects. I don't know if I'll be able to forgive. And there is very little to forgive in this book. It is an entrancing read. It is compulsive. It is a reading experience. It was one I read in 2 sittings. And even between those things, I was just thinking about it. Over the past couple of days since I finished it, I just keep thinking about it. I think about passages, the language that Harwicz uses, the specific language, and not just the imagery of a character who's a sexual being, but the imagery of the kiss like a knife raised high, of the aviator diving the plane into this green chaos. Why is it green? The way that she thinks of blowing insects off of a phone that she's thrown away in frustration on the ground. There are so many passages in this book that I can't get out of my mind. And it's the same way as my reading was of Die My Love. This is a book that I have not been able to forget. It's a book that I feel passionate about. And Feebleminded managed to surpass my high expectations. So I would highly recommend, if you haven't explored Harwicz as a writer yet, to dip in. I'm looking forward to reading the 3rd book in the sequence, Tender, which is shorter and just seems to almost perhaps somehow pack an even different punch. But I'll be looking forward to reading this. And this one was translated by Annie McDermott and Carolina Orloff for Charco Press, fantastic publisher. As I had mentioned, I couldn't help but think of Philip Roth, whether it's Portnoy's Complaint, Sabbath Theater, certainly, the way that he would think of language and have this playful sense, this confident sense of language, while also just stripping bare as much as he could. Certainly Steps by Jerzy Kosinski feels in that group, particularly the violence, the dread that sits there. The Sun Hath Looked Upon Me by Calixto Biala is a book that reveals the perspective of a young woman in Cameroon and what her experiences are like, and I think they're very comfortable. And this was really my favorite novel I read in 2022, and Feebleminded in some ways could be that for 2023. Sula by Toni Morrison, I think the raw, the way that a woman's desire is centered in the book and focused. When I think of the harrowing narrator, a writer who's just plunging us into the mind and then not shying away from any subject, any opinion, any outburst. I think, of course, of David Peace, particularly with The Damned United and the great pseudo-biography of Brian Clough. Certainly, the apocalyptic tone that it takes on reminds me of writers like Richard Wright or The Man Who Lived Underground. We think there are many writers who talk about and write literary erotica. It's hard to say, and that's not what Feebleminded is. But one example would be The Life of an Amorous Woman and Other Writings, and this is, I believe, a 17th century work by Ihara Saikaku, and this is sort of an interesting book to examine. Various South Korean writers, Jang Yoon-il or Lee Sung-woo. I've read and put videos up on both these books, which I'll link in the description box below. Certainly something transgressive like The Sufferings of Prince Sternenhoek by Ladislav Klima, which I read this summer. And then I was thinking of the way the language is just propulsive. Reminds me of James Joyce, frankly, of Ulysses. Harwicz is not trying to give us a day in the life, rather she's giving us these many passages, a stream of consciousness that is, a series of chaotic waterfalls and rapids are what we have in Feebleminded. But I would say this book compares very well with the final chapter of Ulysses, with the chapter from Molly Bloom's perspective, very favorably. And then certainly films like David Lynch's Lost Highway, perhaps even Mulholland Drive or Possession, are films that I think compare to the type of emotive force that lies in Harwitz's writing. So I hope everyone's doing well, and continue to read happily, but see you around. Thank you.